Okay, well then let me begin. First, let me welcome everybody to this breakout session. Glad you're here. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. Appreciate your presence. Also, just a quick thanks to ECHO for their commitment to international agriculture development over the years and their contribution to reducing poverty globally. ECHO's been a collaborator on three of our USAID projects, all of which have been in Southeast Asia. And we collaborate very closely with ECHO Asia in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And they've been a great collaborator on this project that I'm going to talk about, as well as a couple of others. So with that, let me get started. What I'm going to do is give an overview of one component of a larger project that's been going on in Cambodia for about the last 6 years. And the main project was called Women in Agriculture Network Cambodia, and it really dealt with ecologically sensitive agricultural innovations and gender under the framework of sustainable intensification. So USAID has funded this project through the Kansas State University Sustainable Intensification Lab. And so that's kind of the framework. So I'm going to talk a little bit about neglected, underutilized species of plants, but also talk a little bit about nutrition, income, these species in the marketplace, and then how we've worked a little bit to take this topic from a development standpoint and work with folks mainly in Siem Reap and Battambang province, Cambodia. Okay, and so that's where we're going. And so your questions can be pretty wide ranging, and I'll do my best at the end to address them. I don't really want to go for more than about 20 minutes and leave at least half of our time for interaction and discussion. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm going to talk about wild gardens and how these neglected, underutilized species can work to improve nutrition and income in our project areas. And so what I'm really talking about with wild gardens is basically probably something that you've already heard about in one form or another. And let me just spend a little bit of time here talking about how we've defined wild gardens in the context of northwestern Cambodia. So really, I'm talking about what you might know as neglected or underutilized species. Perhaps you're familiar with the term orphan crops, famine foods. So these are basically species that have had little attention among breeders, policymakers, researchers, a lot of plants that you may be familiar with, but have just been, for one reason or another, under the radar. You know, moringa might be a great example of a plant that's been around for a long time. ECHO's promoted moringa literally for decades, and it's only been within recent history that it's really begun to become commercialized, but many others out there. And so these species are often indigenous, some aren't. So in the context of Cambodia, I would include chaya as one of the species that we work with that you may be familiar with. And that's native to Central America, but it made its way to Malaysia eventually, and then into Southeast Asia. And so we see it a lot, but it may not technically be a native species, but almost all of them are locally adapted. Some may be semi-domesticated. What our project really focused on were these perennial, neglected, and underutilized species. So we're mainly working with trees, shrubs, vines, ground covers. And so the strategic framework for underutilized plant species a while back referred to NUS as species with underexploited potential. for contributing to food security, health, income generation, and environmental services. Okay, and so a lot of these species are used to some extent by rural folks in Cambodia and farmers. And generally, when we're working in these villages and these communities out in rural areas of Northwest Cambodia, we find that farmers usually fall on some kind of a continuum. Some women in the villages may only harvest certain parts of plants during certain times of the year. Others have been more enthusiastic about collecting some of these plants out of the wild, bringing them onto their own homestead, and really developing a wild garden. And so basically what we're talking about with our project are strategic groupings of these low maintenance perennial wild food plants. Okay, and then using these sometimes for a specific reason. They may be market oriented, so the collection of wild garden species might be focused on a local market, and you might find these species locally, but maybe not regionally. They may be actually focused on something like livestock fodder, and that may be the goal. A lot of these plants have medicinal use, and generally they're consumed within the family. With our project focused on sustainable intensification, we were also interested in these groupings of wild species as a tool to sustainably intensify underutilized land. So if you go into any village in rural Cambodia, you'll find a lot of underutilized land. These may be fence rows, vacant lots, common areas within the community. And what we've been promoting is what we call farming the messy fringe, which is basically intensifying these underutilized areas to make them more productive, in addition to the use and the collection of these plant materials in a homestead situation. The photo on the right is a mature wild garden, and the wild garden term is simply something we've coined that's easy to remember. It seems to be understood well among Cambodians, and it may have another term that you're familiar with, like a food forest. Little bit different than agroforestry and a little bit different than permaculture, but there are elements in all of those terms that seem to overlap. And I don't want to get too hung up on the semantics. So what we were really working on and continue to work on in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand is characterizing the system, looking at these species, how they're used, their presence in the market, how they're traded, and how they flow through village communities. And then what are the constraints to the wider use of these species so that their positive impact can be realized further afield. Okay, and so over the course of the years, we've really come to accept the fact that these species used together as a suite of highly potentialized, useful species can really address specific problems on a regional basis. And so wherever you are, I think the model fits in that a lot of these underutilized species, these wild food plants, can address prevalent problems in your location. And in our case, one of the bigger challenges in Cambodia is lack of farm diversity. And so we've got widespread agricultural land degradation. This is often because of rain-fed single-season rice production in the uplands. Things like cassava production year after year has really played out a lot of the soil characteristics. And so that's reflected in household diets. And so a lot of our research and survey work shows that Cambodia, certainly Myanmar, have some of the least diversified household diets among these Southeast Asian nations. And then also things like outmigration is a cultural phenomenon that's led to the feminization of agriculture, certainly in Cambodia. And so we really need to diversify the agricultural systems, provide diversified income streams, and then look at improving human nutrition, especially hidden hunger, where we're dealing with maybe not deficient overall calorie intake, but certainly minerals and vitamins in the diet. And so really what we've looked at addressing is this diversification challenge. And we see these wild garden systems as a tool to improve the diversity, mostly in smallholder farms. And basically that was the primary challenge that we've addressed, at least initially. And so what we've really looked at specifically are three areas of farm diversification: temporal diversification, spatial diversification, and a multifunctional aspect of a lot of these species. And so the first thing I want to look at is temporal diversification. So in Cambodia, we have two periods of the year where it's extremely difficult to grow what I would call more traditional annual vegetable species. We've got a food gap during the hot, dry season, certainly March and April, particularly April, where it's been dry for several months, temperatures spike, very difficult from a heat standpoint and a water standpoint to grow these typical traditional vegetables. And then the wet season represents a second food gap where certainly in September and October, in this monsoonal tropical climate, there's just daily rainfall and disease pressure increases, waterlogged soils. And so some type of environmental modification is necessary if you're going to grow annual vegetables. Things like tomato are just next to impossible during the wet season in Cambodia. And so we look at this wild garden approach as an alternative food production system to improve food security, almost in conjunction with some of the other food production systems like the predominant rice, paddy rice system, which again, I mentioned is a rain-fed single crop system predominantly in rural Cambodia, and then vegetable production. And so the species that we're working with, especially the perennial wild food plants, often remain productive during both of these food gaps. And oftentimes the farmers can manage individual species to be productive, especially during these times. Secondly is the spatial diversification. So in this tropical Cambodian climate, throughout most of Southeast Asia also, we've got three spatial plant production layers or niches that we can grow species in. And so this mimics the natural ecosystem and creates a better microclimate. It improves resilience on the farm and sustainability. And so we really look at mixing species in this system that would include trees like certain palms, cashew, neem, smaller trees, and species like bamboo, giant bamboo, moringa, fishtail palm, papaya, and then shrubs like katuk, chaya, saom, which is Acacia pinnata, along with low-growing ground cover species or vines like galangal, vegetable fern, leaf pepper, ginger, turmeric. And so taken together, these species can form something close to a more natural ecosystem and become really productive on a relatively small area of land. Then finally, the third area that we focused on in terms of farm diversification was looking at species that have multiple functions. And that may be for animal fodder, presence in the local market. Certain species have an oil component, and so fuel or energy from an oil component or a fuel wood component can be important, as well as medicine and household nutrition. And here are just some of the species that were commonly found in our wild garden work in Southeast Asia. So if we look more specifically at a couple of our goals, including nutrition and income, in our project area, as in many places around the world, the diet is heavily based on rice. And so even though we may see adequate caloric intake, there's often deficiencies in micro and macronutrients. And so these collections of neglected, underutilized species can be a very effective approach to dealing with things like hidden hunger. Okay, and so many of the plants that we're promoting and using in these systems are nutrient dense. So I would look at things like acacia, chaya, moringa as important components of these systems. Even if it's simply fortifying something like a property line or a fence row or a plot around a home. And so the diversity of diet and then the quality is important. And this can be a very low input, low cost approach to improving the dietary component. So a lot of these species that we're working with, some of which have no nutritional analysis in the literature, can be important in a case of Acacia pinnata, which is Saum, or climbing wattle is another common name. In our nutritional analysis, we found that it's very high in beta carotene, which is a precursor to vitamin A. And it really addresses things like vitamin A deficiency, childhood blindness. And so some of these plants have a very unique role in the mix when we look at nutrition. As far as income goes, oftentimes we'll go into a region in Cambodia and start at the market and see what of these species that we're interested in are actually present in the market that have market pull. And this is often an important component because these varied income streams can really make for a much more robust household income picture overall. And some of these species, in addition to being used at home, are grown specifically for the market. Okay, and so noni berry, acacia pinnata, moringa, ivy gourd, gooseberry, these are all plants that we find commonly used in the wild garden systems that we're working with. In the income for those, this is simply Cambodian currency here used, but oftentimes the translation into dollars is relatively high compared to other commodities that are being produced on the farm. So some of our research also worked with farmers that had highly productive wild gardens, surveying farmers in different villages across these two provinces to see really what are the important components of the use of these species in their systems. And so certainly making money from the plants and using these plants locally as currency even is important to them. Then you've got other situations where the species actually replace expenditures in addition to food, such as medicine, building materials, and livestock fodder. So a case in point would be our Saum or Acacia pinnata. We call it climbing wattle also. This is certainly a cash crop. You can find it in most local markets in Cambodia and Thailand, even in Myanmar and Laos in Vietnam, very high in vitamin A. And then the other component is locally, especially in Battambang province, that's a little bit wealthier than Siem Reap province. There's more livestock, and this species is used as a living fence. Some of our work also included working with women in the different villages, forming nursery associations and propagating Acacia pinnata for sale. And this has been a fairly successful endeavor for these women who want to start nursery businesses. So the last thing I really want to address and talk about here before we run out of time is a way to look at this system as a whole and how we've compared introducing this wild garden system approach compared to some other alternatives that farmers may have tried in the past or may be considering. And our focus has been on gender in particular. And so what we do is we look at assessing these interventions from the basis of the Sustainable Intensification Assessment Framework, which looks at productivity, metrics within productivity, metrics within economics, environmental metrics such as biodiversity, human factors like household nutrition and health, and then finally social factors like gender, equity, social cohesion, these types of metrics. And so if we're looking at our experiences with women farmers in these communities, working with these wild food plants in these wild gardens compared to, let's say, traditional vegetable gardening. And so we're basically using this assessment framework to compare one system to the other. And some of the results here have been real interesting, especially from the standpoint of gender. So one thing that we found is that women are usually the caretakers of wild gardens. So food production around the homestead usually falls under the venue of women, and it's under their control. They're the gatekeepers. And so this is important, particularly because women, at least in Cambodia, often have little extra time to manage new enterprises. And this is especially important when we look at phenomena like outmigration of the men for wage-paying jobs. And in the case of Cambodia, a lot of the men have left for urban areas in Vietnam and in Thailand. And so time management among women as the head of household is really important. And so looking at the labor requirements becomes a big issue. And so when we compare the labor requirements for something like these perennial wild food species compared to a traditional annual vegetable garden, we find that the balance tips in favor of wild gardens because once established, these plants are highly adaptable. They often need very little care, and they can be somewhat more self-sustaining. So we also look at household nutrition, biodiversity that these species mixes present. And so from a biodiversity standpoint, wild gardens can become very important because these perennial species stick around. We can more or less place them into these marginal or underutilized areas and really maximize those parts of the village. And then the nutritional component is often really important. Sometimes the profitability based or compared against the labor requirement is an important consideration. And that's why this market component and the market surveys that we've done are really important. We'll go into a regional market and document market prices of the species through the year. And that can be a real deciding factor among women when they were thinking about whether or not to grow the species. And then community building. So these wild garden species are often in the informal seed system and they're traded, they're not commercially available. And so the social cohesion factor becomes very important. And so when we look at the wild gardens in Cambodia, at least, we know it's a very suitable and sustainable technology. And we're working now on constraints to scalability. Okay, and so on the plus side, this really provides a high level of resilience and sustainability. These are low maintenance systems, low farmer risk. They can be used as a standalone technology, and we've documented the market pull. And they're also importantly insulated from regional competition. About 70% of Cambodians' vegetables come in from Thailand and Vietnam. And it also addresses the gender sensitive aspects like the feminization of agriculture, where the men have outmigrated. Some of the constraints have to do simply with availability of the germplasm, traditional knowledge, how to use these species in traditional diets, and then again, the migration from rural households and passing this use knowledge or indigenous knowledge down to younger generations. And so with that, I've gone a little bit longer, Elliot, than I wanted to, but I do think we've got some time for questions.
All right, thanks, Rick. Yeah, that's no worries. We still have a little time for questions, about 13 or so minutes. And we already got some good ones here on the Q&A tab. So encourage you all to continue to post them, and I'll try to get through as many as we can here. So the first question deals with curation and access to ethnobotanical repositories, and how can tech help understanding the local ethnic knowledge? So I think maybe two parts of that question. Is there any access to ethnobotanical repositories? And then how can technology help in understanding the local ethnic knowledge?
Excellent question. And two quick examples. One is in northern Thailand with the EcoAsia Seed Bank. We first started this project in northern Thailand where we were looking at strengthening the informal seed system. And we essentially used EcoAsia's seed bank as the repository for a lot of these species we were going out and discovering, finding in markets, finding in farmers' fields, and working in conjunction with the farmers to get these species and land races of these particular species into the ECHO seed bank. And ECHO would contract with and work with local farmers to develop that germplasm and to build up the stocks so that it could be distributed. In Cambodia, we've been working with the World Vegetable Center as well as the National University of Battambang, and they've served a similar function as basically a germplasm repository with the goal of getting these specific species and land races out to groups and development groups and organizations that can use them. So it's fairly informal, and it works without it being too formalized. And so that's a key component of basically finding, understanding how the farmers value these plants. So a lot of times the genetic differences are subtle, and working with the farmers to really document where these land races really shine and where they're valuable is the kind of the background information component, in addition to actually conserving and preserving the actual germplasm.
That's really interesting. That's great. Maybe Rick, if you wouldn't mind, you could stop sharing your screen, then we can see you more face to face as much as we can in a virtual setting here. But thank you for answering that question.
How's that?
Yep, that's good. That's good. Let's see. Another question here is, do you have any online identification guides for wild vegetables or edible weeds? Any good tips on how people can, or any tools they can use to help identify them in the field?
Good question. One thing that's important would be local groups that you can work with. So with certainly with these species and neglected, underutilized species in general, it's very regionalized or even localized. And so if you, for instance, were working in West Africa, you might be dealing with species completely different than what we're dealing with in Southeast Asia. And so certainly finding the right organization. So for instance, in our work in Thailand and Cambodia, EcoAsia has a couple of good guides. One guide is an identification guide, but it's also essentially a cookbook for a lot of these more common underutilized species. Also, World Vegetable Center is a good resource. And for some of those species not covered both by EcoAsia and World Vegetable Center, we're developing some local resources through the University of Battambang that would work as an identification guide. And so these tend to be regional, and we're focusing mostly on Southeast Asia species. But I would look to universities, NGOs, and groups like ECHO in your region that might have a fairly long-standing history of collecting, preserving, and using these plants.
Yeah, that's great. I was thinking, some, depending on where you are in the world, some extension services or something similar to that may be a good resource to reach out to in the local context. So thanks, Rick. Got another question here. Stacy asks, do many of these crops need processing before consumption, like chaya? And does that impact the adoption by smallholder families?
Yeah, great question, and it does. So there are a couple of components to this question. Certainly, things like chaya would need to be processed. There needs to be a boiling process to get rid of some of the compounds that are unhealthy from a nutritional standpoint. The other thing that we deal with sometimes are myths or old wives' tales concerning the plant. So with chaya, for instance, a lot of rural farmers believe this plant to cause cancer, and so that's something that we often talk about. And probably this is just maybe a little bit of information that's lost in translation. And so somebody at some point in time was talking about getting rid of cyanic acid or something in a plant, or an alkaloid, and how to treat it. And that translated into, what they're calling cancer. And so we find that, where that is kind of the common theme in a village, the plant is still being used, but it's being used for a different purpose than human nutrition. And so in the case of Cambodia, the chaya is one of the main feed sources for insects like crickets. So cricket production is a big deal, and chaya is what's often being fed to the crickets.
That's fascinating. I didn't hear that before. Local knowledge and overcoming some of those wives' tales or folk lore that you might be associated with plants can certainly be a challenge. All right. Well, Lucas here says, what can proponents of conventional agroforestry practices learn from the wild garden concept?
Also a great question. What we're finding is that some of these species are really important locally, but haven't really been in a production system per se. And so I'll give you one example of Diplasium esculentum, which is vegetable fern. This is common indigenous plant in Southeast Asia, certainly in northern Thailand, and often collected from the wild. And some of the work we've done with these projects is to collect it from the wild and then look at how it adapts to a production system. How much shade it needs under artificial production, best propagation methods, best ways to increase biomass. And so we can then, once we have that information, develop a system that lends itself much more to a more conventional agroforestry system, where maybe we wouldn't have 25 or 30 species in the mix like we would with a wild garden. Maybe it's much more narrowly defined. But certainly with something like vegetable fern, which is shade requiring, that could be a species that fits a tree crop production system very easily. And so what I would recommend would be looking at some of these species to see how they might complement each other and really leverage that local environment that you have.
All right, thanks, Rick. Prashant is asking about the role of non-timber forest products. There's no other part to that question, but maybe you could just address some of that, Rick, if you have anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, something that I've always found fascinating in our work in both Thailand and Cambodia are just the reservoir of indigenous knowledge around the medicinal uses of these plants. Sorry about that. And so we're certainly not as used to that in the US, but in Southeast Asia, a lot of the knowledge base around these plants is extensive. And I think we need to do a better job of documenting that indigenous knowledge in terms of both the wild food species, how they're used, and just their usefulness in that regard. Oftentimes the culinary uses tend to be more localized. And so the other aspect of this is certainly in areas like rural Cambodia, northern Thailand, where the ethnic diversity is great, is just the breadth of the culinary uses, how these plants are used, things like whitethorn rattan, which, for instance, the heart of the stems are the primary economic component. Just a wealth of information there under this non-timber use category that really needs to be documented. And a lot of it's local.
All right, we just have another minute or two here, but let me get to one more here. Tyler asks if there are any recommendations for price tracking locally on a regular and larger regional scale in places where many sellers may be illiterate.
Yeah, so one thing that we've done is we've looked at the market presence. This is a really important component because it's often used to actually show farmers or farmer associations income potential. This also changes during the season. And especially where you have farmers that may be illiterate, we do card sorts. And so we have an extensive library of photos on cards. And so we can sit down, usually with the aid of a translator, and go through the cards to make sure that we're on the same page as far as what species we're talking about. And then mainly sticking to probably 75% of the species that tend to be more common and certainly present in the most marketplaces that we look at. And so the card sorts are useful. The other point is tracking price through the season, because that can really influence, when a farmer might be targeting, for instance, a particular market because there's a distinct difference in price, and that usually relates to availability of the plant. So with a little bit of environmental modification, a farmer may be able to target an early season or a late season market for something that may be fairly common and get a little bit of a price support there. So that would be a possibility, but basically it's just spending time in the market using card sorts and then documenting those prices. And sometimes they change pretty quickly with some species.
All right, thanks for the insight there, Rick. Yeah, what an important piece of being able to understand those prices and help the farmer to make a more informed decision on when to sell and get the best price at market. Hopefully more tools will be developed for people in local areas to be able to share that information. So we are out of time, but we have this next 10 minutes or so as sort of networking time. So for those of you that may want to stick around, Rick, if you don't mind, just maybe a couple more minutes of your time, we could get just a couple more questions here. Thank you. That would be very much appreciated. There's a couple more here that, let's see, Micah asks, is overharvesting of food plants in the wild an issue in Cambodia?
It is. That's a good question. For certain species, it certainly is. We found that to be the case in Thailand as well. So, one of the practical points was when we were working in some of the northern Thai villages, the women that were harvesting vegetable fern, as an example, were having to go further and further afield to collect. And so getting this species, not domesticated, but into a production system becomes more and more important. And that was one of the research projects adopted by EcoAsia that is still going on and has become very useful. And so, that is certainly a possibility. And the other thing that we've been looking at is habitat loss. So in Cambodia, where the economy in recent years prior to COVID had actually been pretty good, GDP growth rates 10% or more, an awful lot of construction. And with that comes, some pressure on habitat. And so a lot of the upland areas were being mined for things like limestone, gravel for road construction and that sort of thing. And so we're finding pretty accelerated habitat loss in addition. So that also is a consideration.
Okay, thank you. Angel asks, it looks like these wild garden plants have great nutritional values, which you could use humans or animal husbandry. But how palatable are they for wild animals? Do you have to use preventative measures to prevent wild animals from eating them, or have you had any experience with these sorts of pests?
Well, in our experience in Southeast Asia, it's not been the wild animals that have been the problem. It's been domesticated animals. So if you've got a neighbor that's it's got a water buffalo or hogs, that can be an issue. That's one of the reasons why in Battambang province, Acacia pinnata is so widely used as a living fence. It's basically keeping livestock out of these wild gardens that have been established. And so, as in many places after the rice harvest, cattle especially are allowed to basically range freely, and there's not a lot of fencing. And so that's been the real mammal constraint, if you will.
Yeah, that's interesting. Keeping our domesticated animals where they should be is certainly a big problem around the world. Let's see. Let's take maybe two more here, and then we'll go ahead and close. Noah asks, are there specific components or compositions that are checked in a plant before it's approved for human consumption?
Yeah, good question. So some of these species have no documented nutritional analysis in the literature. And so part of our project dealt with getting this done with some of the species we were interested in, like whitethorn rattan, fishtail palm, vegetable fern, some of these species that we could just find no nutritional analysis at all in the literature. And so one of our collaborators was Kasasat University in Bangkok, and they had a very good agricultural nutrition program where they could do the analysis. Other great resource is the World Vegetable Center, and a lot of these underutilized species have been analyzed. It's just not commonly available, but they have a great database of information on a good many of these species that are less common. And then the other local resource, of course, are local women, especially in the villages and in the region. You know, they have this indigenous knowledge that's been generated over usually, you know, several generations. And, you know, and we often overlook that as a guide as well.
Yeah, that's a good resource. I know that's a challenge for some people to be able to find any sort of resources on these nutritional aspects of these underutilized crops. So to have a university that's able to do some of that analysis too is great.
I know that
okay.
A long time Martin Price would talk about improving the diversity of the species available and not relying on any one too heavily. It's kind of the graze a little bit here and there approach, just to be sure.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think he says, eat like a goat, not a cow." But so maybe last question, we probably better wrap up here, but Elijah asks, do you see a challenge with people considering some of these wild species to be poor people's food? And how, or have you engaged in bringing a new perspective or had difficulties with that perspective?
Yeah, so that certainly is an issue, and it's a good question, and it's a matter of changing perceptions. In the case of Cambodia, a lot of these species are still, you know, considered famine foods. But listening to the stories of some of these older individuals, for instance, that had lived through the Khmer Rouge period in Cambodia, you know, they know these plants based on that experience, and then continue to use them to their advantage. And so the other thing that's interesting, kind of on the other side of that coin, is that a lot of younger people don't have that generational knowledge now passed down to them, but are very interested in how they fit into modern cuisine. And so I'm finding more and more upscale restaurants in the capital of Phnom Penh that are interested in a lot of these species, you know, like their local vegetable fern. And so there's this renewed interest among the younger generation that has no history with the particular plant.
Yeah, that reminds me of some of the work in Central America that organizations have been doing, and promoting some of their heritage foods like chaya or other things that most of the public doesn't know about, but
Yeah.
they've been promoting them through very nice culinary outlets and restaurants, showcasing them and developing recipe books and cookbooks, and you know, very high value or high production value stuff. It looks great on a plate, and it gets people intrigued because we've got kind of that foodie culture around the world of people trying to rediscover those things. That's neat.